Hello, everybody. Welcome back to part two of my review of the British Empire. And let's just jump right in. So, our two talks about the 1600s and how ever since then the British, when they arrived, I guess they arrived with the intention of trading. They arrived like as aliens would, like we come in peace, right? We just want to trade. We want to see what you guys got and see what we can offer you in exchange and trade, do business, right? But a lot of them did go to other to the areas like India or even Canada as rulers or settlers, right? Rulers like to rule and govern the people that were already there, and settlers like to move away from the British Isles and to settle down in different areas. Um, Now it starts off by talking about India and the Indian way of life, and Calcutta specifically in East India, and how, for example, Charles Stewart from the Indian Company, um, he basically they would call him Hindu Stewart because back then they actually embraced the Indian way of life. There was this notion of like Anglo Indians, which they get into later in the documentary. But I think that was the exception, right? The rule, or what would generally happen, is that they would go there and they would like dominate the area, right? Now, it's very interesting because then they start talking about mensahibs, which are the wives of the sort of viceroys, and they're missionary wives. So they were Christian Puritans that were trying to convert the Indians into Christianity, right? But we see in this second hour that there were a lot of divisions, right? Like for example, they talk about the bungalow houses, and the bungalow houses were basically like areas within the localities or within the sites that were basically English, right? So even though they were in a foreign country, in foreign land, the British wanted to live how they did back home, right? They even wrote a book. They talk about the book in this hour that tells that the Indians are like kids, so you have to treat them kind but firmly. It's obviously very racist. And then they talk about Singapore, how the British founded Singapore in 1819 with Thomas Stamford Raffles. So my question here was like, what was nobody here before? Because they say Malays came in, Indians came in, and Chinese came in into Singapore. So Singapore is like a mixture of those three cultures. And even here in Singapore, they talk about how the British settlers in 1852, opened up the Singapore Cricket Club. So the cricket club was where the British would come together, and it was a place that was more like home. It was very exclusive. They wouldn't even serve the local food. They like everything they would serve there was from Britain, right? Basically, it was British food, and it was meant to make the British feel like they were at home, right? While they were in a foreign land. So that's kind of weird, right? But I mean, it makes sense at the same time because if you come from a different land or a different place and you don't have the same type of culture, you're gonna want to have like that culture near you or around you, right? At times, and I guess they got it with the cricket clubs, which cricket was like a big thing. They get into the whole sports thing later on in the documentary, but I guess the British were big on sports, or are big on sports, like racehorsing, cricket, and they extended this to their empire, like with Singapore and Hong Kong, with the racehorses, which we'll get into that later on. Okay, so also we jump all the way to Canada, and they talk about the settlers in America, how in Canada they make a permanent new home, and this was in 1831 with Adam Ferguson. So he was actually looking for somewhere new to settle, and they go into like this moment where where we end up going into Fergus, Canada, I believe is the name of the town. And you know, this place has tradition, family history, links to the Scottish, to their Scottish roots, which was by Adam Ferguson. Now let's remember that the Scottish are part of the British Empire, right? It's Wales, Scotland, England, and Ireland, Northern Ireland, right? But it's kind of interesting because in Fergus, it's very peaceful, right? Like, basically, there were no battles fought. Like, the people just got there, settled, and, you know, up because they show modern, you know, like I said, Jeremy Paxman travels all over the world, basically. And I think that was pretty cool in the documentary. It looks like that was a lot of work to do to actually go to the sites and talk to the locals and get to know the areas and the history. And he does this with Fergus also. So he's there. He witnesses some type of celebration that they have, and it's just like a normal Canadian town, right? But it's so interesting because it's like the reason these people are here is because, you know, and you hear about this when, you know, some may say, oh yeah, my you know, my ancestors came over from Scotland or whatever. But it's like they were part of the British Empire. They were part of this migration, right? They were part of the settlers that were coming in from the British Empire, and or within the boundaries of the British Empire, I guess, because Canada was part of the British Empire at some point. Um, and that's why they got there, right? So I think that's the interesting thing. But yeah, Fergus is, I guess, I don't want to say exceptional, but it is a peaceful place with Scottish ancestry. Now, then they get into Africa. How Europe tries to, they call it a scramble for Africa. So Europe tries to grab Africa, and this is seen with Kenya in the 1900s. They talk about the Kikuyus versus the British, and how Kenya gains its independence after 1960, after the 1960s. But the fact that like a lot of British are still living there, right? Like peacefully, like a lot of these rulers, settlers, traders, you know, they just stayed there because I guess they liked the place or maybe for business. Excuse me. So I think that was kind of interesting. They talk about Nairobi, which was a capital that was not planned, and it's a farming land. And then this is where they get into the lunatic rail, which I think was really interesting. So the lunatic rail was built basically to go from Lake Victoria to Mombasa, and it's a trade route. Now, what's interesting about this is that it wasn't the British. I mean, it was the British Empire that built it, but locally it was Indians that built it. Indians that came due to the labor shifts, like when I mentioned last video, when they would bring over like slaves, or you know, the British were big on transporting goods and people, right? So a lot of Indians left India and they end up in Africa, like building the lunatic railway. And I think a lot of these people moved there because of the discontent, maybe back in India, or they didn't have money or opportunities in their home country. And I think this may be just the general factor as to why people leave their land. But what's so interesting about this lunatic building, the building of the lunatic railway, which they call it the Lunatic Line because you had to go uphill and then downhill, and it was just lunatic, I guess. Um, Kenya gains its independence in 1963 from the Indians, and then they start to have like this fight. The Kenyans start to fight the Indians that are still living in Africa and Kenya. So the Indians, the Africans are like, we don't want you here. Like, what are you still doing here? Like, you know, they probably saw the Indians as a reminder of the colonization, right? So they didn't want the Indians there, which is racist at the end of the day. But you're kind of thinking like, well, it is the Kenyans' place, and the Indians got there because of the British, right? Uh, so the British are forced to give refuge to to the Indians, right? And it's kind of interesting because they go to London, and Jeremy Paxman ends up interviewing this family of Indians who used to live in Kenya, who came from India. So it's like they're Indians, they have the Indian culture. Then they were living in Kenya, so they were able to get to know the African culture, the Kenyan culture, and now they're living in London, so they get to know the London culture, right? The English culture. So it's like you have three cultures. I mean, that's got to be crazy and very interesting. And then they talk about the Wani night in London and how they celebrate it. And this makes sense because I've noticed, or I've learned, that in London, they're really big on Indian food and on foreign food, right? You have like Bollywood also, which is the Hollywood in Bombay. Um, yeah, and in this case, they refer to the Indians as Asians. So they say the Asians are sent to Britain and they settle in Leicester. Leicester. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Um, but yeah, in this case, they say that there is like one fourth of the people living there um, are Indians, right? And Diwali night is this celebration where basically I think Diwali means like lights in Hindi. So there's lights in London, and they end up this second hour like on a pretty good note, talking about how the empire changed the world, but also the world was changed by um, no, sorry, the empire changed the world, right? But the world also changed the empire, yeah. And Jeremy Paxman at the end, he always tries to confront people and ask them like, was this a good thing? Was this a bad thing? And I think he just likes to play devil's advocate because if the person's like, "Oh yeah, I thought this was really bad," like he was doing with Sarah Agassi from the First Hour. She was the one that was involved. Sarah Agassi. She was the Jewish militant that was involved in the attack on King David on the King David Hotel that killed a lot of people. And he tries to like question her, like, do you think that was a good thing? Do you think there were some benefits that the British brought over, or like stuff like that? And it kind of makes the person think, like, so if like normally the local that's living there or whatever takes this stance, like, yeah, the British were bad. Jeremy plays devil's advocate and tries to, make the person question that, like, but weren't there good things? And he does the opposite with people that are like, yeah, I think the British were great, and he tries to like, but don't you think they did some bad things, or like I said, it's complex. The empire was complex. Um, so it's very interesting because at the end of this second hour, this family that was from India that lived in Kenya and now resides in London. Jeremy Paxman asks them like, what do you guys make of this? Like, are you happy that this happened? Are you happy you're here now? And they're like, yeah, they're like, we're very thankful to the empire, to the British, and he kind of tries to play devil's advocate, like, but didn't they do bad things? And they're like, no, I mean, they've given us like, a solution to the problem, especially after Kenya gained its independence in the 1960s, right? Which makes you think about like the whole Jerusalem and Holy Land ordeal with the British, the Jewish, and the Arabs, right? Um, like promising land, and then you can say, well, it is your responsibility. That's why I think like superpowers like maybe the United States or the British Empire do need to take that responsibility, because after all, like, and I'm referring to the responsibility of letting those affected come to your country, because after you try to oversee all of the problems in the world, right? And some just don't turn out the way you want them to, like in this case, the Indians uh, ending up in Kenya after Kenya gains its independence from Britain. I mean, it's like, so you can't just be like, okay, well, Indians go back to India, like, no, now you have to take them in, you have to take responsibility for your actions, right? So I think that was that it ended on a good note. And yeah, this is my review for part two. So be on the lookout for part three. That's all I got for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.